to the second online political psychology meeting. Today we have a very special edition. So today we have a symposium on the reflections on the past and future of political psychology in the Netherlands. And me, Ruthie Plisken, and Janneke van der Toorn and Bert Bakker, we organized this already last year in March 2020. And well, we all know what happened, of course. We couldn't have a physical meeting. So now I'm very happy that in the end we are able to have this online. And so just practical, if you have a question, there's a Q&A box below. And then we can check your question and use it in discussion if we have time. And well, Mark Deschênes is the moderator, so I will give him the floor. And I'm looking very much forward to all your reflections. Oh, maybe unmute yourself, Mark.
I put myself on unmute, so yeah, so. It's really exciting to actually be able to do this symposium, although we have been thinking it would be offline, a much more fruitful experience than online, but still, you know, to do this and to be able to be here is a special occasion. So I wrote a brief introduction just to explain what we're about to do. And so it started all when Henk Dekker and I were talking about political psychology over a cup of coffee at Café du Doc in The Hague. So Henk mentioned the initiatives that had existed in the 1980s and 1990s regarding political psychology in the Netherlands, and showed two publications that may rightfully be considered among the first truly political psychological publications in the Netherlands. So what struck me was how much the issues discussed in the publications remain among the most interesting for political psychology today. So think of protests, authoritarianism, and leadership. At the same time, the fact that we're having this meeting digitally and that we're having this meeting in English also suggests that things are different now relative to then. And this is how we came to the idea of setting up a symposium where we seek to compare the then with the now of political psychology in the Netherlands. It can be fruitful to go beyond specific research findings and projects to reflect on where political psychology in the Netherlands stands as a whole. And we believe comparing the then with the now provides an opportunity to reflect on some of the big questions of political psychology that concern all of us. Are we progressing as a field? Has there been true innovation? What has remained the same over the past decades? And what has changed? And are these changes for the good or for the bad? The idea of the meeting is to bring together contributors of different generations. Bert Kleinerman, Henk Dekker, and Christel de Landsheer are all highly distinguished scholars whose experience span over 30 years, while Maarten van Bezo and Laura Mulder represent the best of a new generation. We also asked Sabine van Zuidam, but unfortunately she was unable to attend. So the presentations has been planned to be in couples, with each couple addressing a sub-area of political psychology. Bert and Maarten will address social movements. Henk and Laura will address political socialization. And Christel and Sabine were scheduled to address profiling, and I'm sure that Christel will still do so by herself. During the first round, Bert will talk about his experience from the past, and Maarten will present his recent research. Bert will then discuss Maarten's findings, and jointly, Bert and Maarten will provide some reflections and statements about the way political psychology of social movements has changed or remained the same. In the second round on political socialization, Henk and Laura will do essentially the same. Henk will provide some reflections. Laura will present her research. Henk will discuss, and Laura and Henk will jointly present some statements regarding the ways in which political psychology of political socialization has changed or has remained the same. In the absence of Sabine, Christel, the floor is yours when it comes to profiling. After the presentations by our contributors, the discussion is open. Hopefully, at the end of the meeting, we'll have a better understanding of the progress that political psychology has made and where to we should go from here. So without further ado, let me give the screen to Bert Kleinerman to make an introduction on social movement and political movements.
Okay, thank you. Can you see and hear me, or do I have to? I don't have pictures, I don't have figures, but let me start with an anecdote. 1999, the annual meetings of the ISPP were in Amsterdam. Those of you who know Amsterdam, in the Okura Hotel. David Winter was then the president. I was with Crystal, local organizer. We wanted to give the attendees some good Dutch couleur locale. Hence, we organized sessions on everything the Netherlands was infamous in those days: drugs, abortion, prostitution, and euthanasia. We thought this to be of interest for the audience. To our amazement, most of these sessions only draw small audiences, but there's more to tell. We invited a former Secretary of Immigration, an ongoing issue in the Netherlands, like anywhere in Europe. Important as the guest speaker was, we planned a plenary session and asked for one of the bigger rooms. Arriving at the lecture hall, an impressive crowd was filling the space. Unfortunately, however, they were from the previous session and left to enjoy Amsterdam in the nice weather, and we were left with a handful of listeners. It's not yet over. There's more to come. The past secretary used to author a weekly column in the Volkskrant, a major Dutch newspaper. He devoted the first column after our conferences to write a cynical commentary about academic tourism. So far, the anecdote. Those were the days that there was a Dutch branch of the ISPP located at the VU, merely social psychologists like myself and Peter Kerkhoff, Leiden and University of Amsterdam, with Leiden Henk Dekker, and at a later point, Rudy Anderweg, mostly political scientists. Not very big, only 25 members. And we had an interesting deal with the ISPP. We paid our dues to the Dutch branch, and then the Dutch branch transferred the money from our cash to the International Society, to ISPP. Actually, you save a lot of bank transfer bills if you do it that way. So it's not possible to do it now anymore, but yeah, it worked in that time. But it was too small eventually, the organization to survive. Not big, some 25 members, and it was too small, in fact, to survive. After almost any member has been an officer for some time, the Dutch organization faded away. But not forever, and not completely. In fact, each of the three groups continued to actively engage in political psychology, be it that the activity transferred to the international level, and new groups emerged. In my own field, political participation, the University of Groningen became an important part for our group, our subgroup, with social psychologists as Martijn van Zomeren and Tom Cosmos. PhD students for both universities defended their thesis. If it was somebody from Groningen, somebody from Amsterdam was on the opposition, or the other way around. All in all, two very The recording is started. Okay. I was just explaining that the ISPP was established in 1978, and the first conference on the first conference, 185 papers were presented. 40 years later, in 2017, more than 1,000 papers were presented at the conference. In those years, membership increased as well to approximately 900. And over the years, the ISPP developed from a predominantly American organization into a real international society. Its annual meetings were alternately held in Europe and in the United States. And interestingly, the European meetings were always better attended than the US meetings. It also became more professional. During my presidency, we turned to a professional central office and executive secretary. Seth Bennett, that some of you may have worked with her at some point. During the 2020s, the 41st volume of the Society's flagship journal, Political Psychology, was issued. During those years, the 40 years, the Society's journal got better and better, as the bibliometrics show. The same holds for the annual meetings. Over the years, the level of the meetings improved considerably. In her report on 40 years ISPP, past President Kate Reynolds concludes that the central themes, and Mike was actually making that same point, the central themes stayed consistent and crucial for the ISPP. In 1978, the very first conference, the themes were conflict, violence, and terrorism, leadership and political personalities, political behavior, political participation and civic engagement, public opinion and political communication, and last, new theoretical and methodological developments. Similar sessions were on the program still in 2020, but many more other issues were also addressed. I'm trained as a social psychologist. I defended my dissertation in 1983 on a mobilization campaign of the Dutch Labor Union. My first article in the American Sociological Review is based on this study. I found social psychology in those days less and less interesting, more and more experimental, more and more narrow. I found it difficult to tailor my topic into experimental designs. As a consequence, I got more and more involved in sociology. That was the discipline where most of the research on social movements took place. Ironically, it was the fact that I was doing social psychological kind of research questions made most of my known in the sociology circle. So the social psychology done in the sociology circle. The first article that I mentioned already in the ASR had a subtitle, Social Psychological Expansions of Research Mobilization Theory. Two important elements as social psychologist, I was interested in the individual level of analysis and in comparative analysis. All the studies I conducted were comparative, comparing countries, comparing movements, comparing protest events. The last decade, increasing number of social psychologists got interested in political participation, be it in political parties or social movements or both. Many of them engaged in the ISPP. Ben Simone and myself on politicized collective identity, my presidential address on identity politics and politicized identities, and Van Zomeren's social identity model of collective action, SIMCA. So this kind of research became an important element of our part of the political psychology. Right now, I would say that the group in Groningen has overtaken the VU. Some retired, some left, PhD students into the field. Social psychologists discovered. Interesting, innovative, also in the Netherlands, as witnessed by the active existence of this group. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Yeah, so I already have a lot of thoughts, but let's give the floor to Maarten.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm sharing slides for this one. And what I'll present is sort of a brief overview of my dissertation research that I defended last year. And it was supervised by Bert Kleinerman, amongst others. And as a starting point of my dissertation, that's on political inaction, I want to show you this figure that's actually from Bert's early research on the different barriers that need to be overcome to become a participant in the social movement. So you see on the bottom line that there are different barriers, different steps that need to be taken. And the starting point of my PhD research was sort of the top line of different steps. So people who might not sympathize with a certain movement, who might not be motivated, or just in general, who do not participate in any political action. And theoretically, I think a lot of my work sort of traces back to social identity theory. It helped, having studied in Groningen. I worked with some of the researchers that Bert mentioned in Groningen, working on social identity theory to explain political action as a collective and intergroup relations process, where people of lower status groups share grievances, feel efficacious, and share a certain identity to engage in political behavior. So there's a clear us versus them and in the intergroup relations. And there's a certain hostility and a feeling that something can be achieved politically. And focusing on inaction, I took another part of social identity theory to sort of study why in some cases there is no conflict between groups. So an us versus them can exist without intergroup hostility, without political behavior. And I looked back at the original social identity theory, where the concept of social creativity is mentioned. And this is one part that it's hardly been studied since. There are like some studies, some articles on it, but very little in fact. And I think social creativity allows people who have a negative social identity, so a lower status compared to an outgroup, to rationalize this lower group status and to find a different way to define the us and the them. One example you see on the right there, the poor versus happy. You can imagine a certain group being poorer compared to an outgroup, but instead of focusing on becoming wealthier, sort of fighting the rich, so to say, they could also reinterpret the situation as we're poor, but we're still happy. So there's less hostility and less likely to be collective action there. What we've done theoretically is build on this original idea and note certain shortcomings and an unclarity in what exactly social creativity is and what it does. And we argue that indeed it can help people cope with the low group status this way, which is very much in line with the original social identity theorizing. But we also argue that for higher status groups who are richer, for example, they can engage in some kind of reverse social creativity and argue that poorer people are friendlier and that there's no need to challenge the current status relations. And it really promotes the hierarchy that's currently existing. And finally, and interestingly for political behavior, we also argue that social creativity can be used to question intergroup relations. You see the example of Black is Beautiful, where a negative social identity is challenged through finding a new interpretation of what it means to be Black in the US in the 1950s and 1960s, and find a more empowering definition of the social identity. So that's I think the real sort of theoretical innovation in my dissertation research, where it's heavily focused on the original theorizing, but finding new ideas around it, new interpretations, and adding to that literature. And for the other chapters, I've tested some of this, but I think the main innovation there was having these existing ideas and finding different methodologies to study them. The first I'm going to briefly mention is focus group research, where we asked people in Brazil, in Hungary, and in the Netherlands to talk about political inaction. We saw that people generally disliked political inaction and blamed different people for it. Some people blamed themselves, but most people actually looked at intergroup relations. They especially blamed politicians, politics, or ineffective social movements for inaction. And we tried to test some of these ideas with an online experiment, so another method yet. We didn't find too strong of an effect of manipulating self-categorization, of how these different levels of explanation relate to one another. And looking specifically at the role of social movements, together with colleagues from Groningen, we went door to door doing a survey in an affected province of Groningen, and it's affected by earthquakes for quite a few decades already because of gas extraction. And focusing specifically on the role of social movements, we asked people what the specific goals were that the local social movements should strive for. And we found that a lot of the collective goals that would help the whole province motivated people to join. But it didn't really match with how the social movement looked, especially for financial compensation. And you can actually see that very few people joined the movement in the end, even though they were heavily affected by the earthquakes. Final method that we used is a larger survey in 8 European countries among Iranian migrants, where we asked what the type of predictors were for people to have a certain confidence in the social political system. And we mainly found that people who are disadvantaged, who feel discriminated against, experience social identity threats, lose confidence in the social political system in Western Europe. And having a very low or very strong confidence in the system were related to inaction. So you see that I've used many different methods to test mostly existing theoretical claims, especially with self-categorization, but also some of the social creativity research. And I felt that there is some innovation there in finding new populations, in perhaps finding a new method or connecting different literatures rather than really putting forward a new concept or finding a completely new topic to study. That's my initial reflection on the novelty versus building on existing work that I'm happy to discuss with you afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Maarten. Bert, I was wondering about your reflections on this research. In part on the basis of, why we asked you and also Henk and also Crystal to pick one research. If they would pick one researcher to present on the most recent insights, who would you choose? And it turned out to be Maarten. No offense to all others, but why did you? What are your reflections on this research?
Well, the one thing, it's comparative, and you know that's what I mean. It's clear that compared in terms of protest and social movement research, I think comparing is essential, because how otherwise would we know that what we find is typically for this movement, typically for this country, or typically for this issue. So that's important. What I actually like most in Maarten's work is the question of inactivity. If you look into the social movement literature, you'll find lots of research based on activity, why people are actively involved in a protest event. But inactivity is sort of stayed in it's not specified, it's not nuanced. So there's also, for not participating, there's many reasons that people can have, and it's not necessarily the other side of the coin. So that's what I find important, and that's of course what he was explaining, the most related to social movement and the political participation. The other thing is the identity. That I didn't say that much about identity in my own talk, but theoretically, what I think the social psychology contributes or did contribute to the study of social movements is social identity, the expansion of social identity in the way of using social identity in collective behavior. So that's the other important reason.
Thank you for that. We asked each duo also to think of some general statements regarding the way then and now compare. Now, I already wrote a couple of things down, but if you were to mention two statements about comparing the then and now, what would you think of?
It's always difficult to say aloud, but the quality of the research, if you compare 40 years ago with today, the quality of the research today is so much better than it used to be in the past. And it's always difficult to make that argument because you also say something about people who were involved into research in those days. But what I sort of ironically give as an example of what could happen in the past, report an article on the psychoanalytical analysis of Khrushchev. That might be interesting, but is that the thing that we should be focusing on? What also changed, and I made the remark that I had found a problem in the social psychology that it became more and more an experimental discipline. Interestingly, it is again also political psychology that is using experimental designs, but much smarter, much more sophisticated than it used to be in the past.
Maarten, do you have a statement to add?
Maybe it's maybe not the most well-defined one, but sort of looking back on this, also my statement about a lot of the theory that I'm using is 1970s basically, some 1980s maybe, and something that I would be interested in discussing is whether we need new theory or whether there's still a lot to be gained by focusing on previous theory and more testing, different methods of testing, different populations that you use in your research, rather than focusing on having a sort of small theoretical innovations here and there. Yeah, I'm curious in exploring that question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for both of your presentations, and let's go back to these issues in the general discussion. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Henk Dekker and Laura Mulder, who will each provide their 2 cents regarding political socialization as another topic of political psychology.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Laura and I, we are well prepared for this session. We had a lot of interesting talks before as a preparation. Laura, do you have my PowerPoint?
Yeah, I can. Do you have it open on your computer? You can share your screen.
Shall I share screen? Yes.
I can also do it for you, but.
Yeah, I have it here. Let me see whether it works. Share. Yes. You see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the first slide shows that it's just one small part of this very interesting field of political psychology. But we focus more in our presentation on political socialization. And it was asked to show a picture. Here is my picture. The photo that I would like to show is a photo of the first political socialization conference in the Netherlands. I organized this conference at the University of Groningen in 1988, together with my colleague and friend Rüdiger Meyerberg from the Karl von Ossietzky Universität in Oldenburg in Germany. We have invited researchers from many countries to report on the state of the art of research in their country. It was not the first and last time that we met our fellow researchers from many countries, because for over 40 years, researchers of political socialization from the Netherlands and many other countries have been meeting, cooperating and supporting each other in, first it was called the Research Committee on Political Education, and later in the Research Committee on Political Socialization and Education of the International Political Science Association. On the occasion of the 40th birthday of this research committee, then German, United States, Bristol de Lange here, Belgium, and I, we wrote a short history of this research committee in factual data and a state of the art of political socialization research and theory building. The article published very recently was published very recently in the journal Politics, Culture and Socialization, and the article is intended as a birthday present for new generations of young researchers worldwide who want to build on what others have already discovered. In the beginning of the research committee, members studied mainly political or civic education at school. Besides the wish to know more, there was also a wish to improve this political education from the realization that a democracy presupposes democratic leaders and citizens, and that these leaders and citizens are not born as such, but need a kind of education for democratic leadership and citizenship. Later, more and more researchers took into account that political education at school cannot be viewed separately from what pupils and students have heard, read, and seen before about politics before. That is the political socialization prior to political education in school in the childhood and early adolescence. To know the initial situation of the political education lessons, let's say point -20, a study of the previous political socialization is necessary. Political education requires more or less an adaptation, addition, and even correction of that political socialization. Researchers also realized that the effects of political education at school in the short and long term are limited or enhanced by the political socialization afterwards, and that this political socialization has to be taken into account in long-term effect studies. Research of political education was expanded and became research of political socialization. Although there are differences in definitions, we expect that many will agree with the following definition. Political socialization is the whole of the processes by and the structures under the influence of which individuals acquire and develop political orientations and behaviors. The processes include the when and the how, and the structures, the who or what. The political orientations include not only cognitions, such as political knowledge and beliefs and opinions, but also affections, such as attitudes, emotions, and values, and behavioral intentions. Fundamental research questions were and are still the following. At what age acquire and develop people which political orientations and behaviors? How do people acquire and develop political orientations and behaviors? Who or what are the sources of political learning and development? Why and when are people willing to accept political messages? And what makes a source most influential. "40 years of research has yielded a lot of insights. Let me mention a couple of them. People acquire fundamental and general political orientations already early in life. I feel I'm Dutch. I like the Netherlands. We have a wonderful king. Things like that. And other people are not so good as the Dutch. These fundamental political orientations acquired at a young age have a persistent, stable character. Even if you don't like it, you still have tears in your eyes if you see the national flag. You can't understand, but stable, and it has a persistent character. Other political orientations are acquired and developed especially, but not exclusively, during the impressionable formative years as adolescents and young adults. We can distinguish three processes through which people acquire political orientations. These three are inference, that is thinking of your own thing, thinking by yourself. That is experiential learning, you learn by experience. Difficult in politics, only a few have that possibility. And finally, accepting the orientations from other people. So three processes: inference, experiential learning, and accepting orientation from others. People accept orientations from others not only because of curiosity and the need of knowledge, or hope for reward or fear of punishment, but also, and maybe especially, because of fundamental psychological needs. Needs such as acceptance, belonging, respect, positive self-identity. If you can offer these kind of, fulfill these needs, the source will be accepted. The relevant others are active in various socialization agents. These agents are placed in the order that more or less corresponds to the order in which socializees come into contact with them in the course of their life. These are family, school, church, mosque, media, peer groups, labor, social movements, and politics. Socializers or influencers work at the same time, are connected to each other, and influence each other. That makes the church quite difficult. Okay. The socializers. The socializers that have most influence are those which are the first informant, which are active for the longest time, have the most power, are considered the most competent and reliable, have the most means, money, and resources to influence, and have the most means and resources to counteract or prevent oppositional influences. A few words about the methodology. It's a central point of attention. Technological advancements have greatly helped empirical research and made it possible to use the best methods. What are the best methods? In my view, these are the following. International, comparative studies. I agree with Bert. Because they can also test national independent variables. Secondly, longitudinal panel studies, because they can test stability and change. And finally, very promising experimental studies applying a Solomon for group design. Because actually, maybe that's the only way to do it, because they can test hypothesized causality and influence. Okay, for the future, some topics deserve much more attention than so far. For example, political leadership socialization, immigrant resocialization, and radicalization. New political and social developments require that we retest what was discovered about political socialization in the past. For example, the great influence of the family. Is that still the case? And that we also study the many new ways to think about internet, Twitter, forms and contents of political socialization from today and also for tomorrow.
Thank you, Henk, for your presentation. I'll give the floor to Laura.
Henk, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. Well,
You can do it. Yeah.
no.
Okay, now I will share mine. Okay. My name is Laura Mulder. I'm a PhD candidate at political science at the University of Amsterdam. And today I'll talk to you about my research. My research focuses on inequalities in democratic engagement among young people, and initiatives to compensate or to reduce these inequalities. And today I will present to you one paper that is about the effectiveness of an initiative to boost democratic engagement. So the starting point of this paper is that there are many concerns about the democratic engagement among young people. So first of all, the level of democratic engagement would be quite low. And also there are a lot of differences or inequalities between social groups, with youngsters from disadvantaged backgrounds being less democratically engaged. And in response to these concerns, many governments intensify their effort to stimulate democratic engagement. And in this effort, they see citizenship education as the sort of the holy grail for all these concerns. And citizenship education consists of multiple categories. And so the first is formal instruction. And it refers to courses in the curriculum that are related to citizenship, such as civics. And the open classroom climate, and it refers to the atmosphere in a classroom or in a school. For example, whether students feel safe to discuss controversial issues. And a third category is voluntary activities, such as participating in a student council or in a debating team. But unfortunately, these activities are troubled by selection effects, as generally the students that are already politically engaged will participate in these activities. And I think that I contribute to the literature by focusing on the fourth category, and that is the compulsory activities that usually take place outside of the school building. I see on-site citizenship education as a good example of these activities. And I will briefly explain to you what these on-site citizenship programs actually are. So the core idea behind these programs is that they take place outside of the school context, and usually at the site of some political or democratic institution. And in most countries, these programs are offered by governments themselves or either by independent organizations that receive government subsidies. An example of such an organization is ProDemos in the Netherlands. And young people, they participate in these programs as part of their formal school curriculum. And the programs usually take one day. And the programs can also assume many forms, but usually they include a visit to a government institution, for example, to parliament or to a country hall or a police station. They also include interaction with government officials, such as members of parliament or judges. Usually they also include some reenactment of government institutions, for example, voting on a law or reenacting a lawsuit. But they may, also include all other sorts of games and quizzes, democracy or politics. And the aims of these programs are twofold. First, they aim to boost democratic engagement, and they also aim to reduce inequalities between social groups. And the expectations for these programs are quite high. But the question is whether these programs succeed in these aims, and that is what I'm testing in this paper. So the first hypothesis that I have is that on-site citizenship education has a positive effect on the democratic engagement among young people. And I theorize that this is the case because of three reasons. First, they are based on experience learning. And the idea behind experience learning is that seeing and experiencing the political arena in real life renders politics less abstract. And it leaves a longer lasting impression than reading from a textbook. And second, the programs, they are what you call a form of edutainment. So they are a combination between education and entertainment, which is proven to be a very effective way of learning. And they are not troubled by selection effects because all students participate in these programs. And the second hypothesis is that on-site citizenship education reduces structural inequalities in democratic engagement on young people. And we know from previous research that there are large differences in the democratic engagement based on, for example, gender, educational level, socioeconomic background, or migration background. And it could be that these programs are suited better for some groups or are adapted better than some groups. And there are three possible ways in which this may work out. And the first scenario is compensation. And the compensation effect predicts that on-site citizenship education has a larger effect on students from disadvantaged backgrounds in order that the gap between the two actually reduces. It could also be that there's reproduction. In that case, the differences between the two groups remains the same. And acceleration is also an option. That means that some groups learn more than others. A larger gap between the two groups. And now to my methods. To test these hypotheses, I wanted to make causal claims. And I tried my best to isolate the causal effects. And most studies within the literature, they're based on observational data, and they rely on questions on past exposure to citizenship education. But in this paper, I use a quasi-experimental panel design, and I compare students that already participated in the program, so in the treatment group, to students that did not yet participate in the program. So this is what I call the control group. And to compare these two groups, I use difference in difference estimation. And what difference in difference estimation basically does is that it compares the growth trajectories of the treatment and the control group in order to come at the intervention effect of participating in the program. I also tried my best to limit the selection effects. I minimize selection effects at the school level, at the class level, and at the pupil level. Because you could say that schools that choose to include on-site citizenship education in their program already differ from schools that do not choose to do this. I look at within school differences, and I focus on schools that participate in the program with all their classes. yeah, and I try to make an isolation of the claims by also introducing a Solomon 4 group design. So in the classical experimental setting, you have a treatment and a control group. You do a pre and a post test. And when the treatment group scores higher, you conclude, okay, there's an effect. But it could also be that when you fill out a survey in the pre-test, you already start thinking about subject and you are sort of primed to those subjects when you receive the intervention. So to rule this out, the Solomon 4 group design adds a second control group for the pre-test. And this control group does not receive the pre-test. And then in the end, you compare this control group to the treatment group. And then there should not be a significant difference. Another thing that I looked at is the effect of the time period. It could be that at the time of the post-test, there's a sort of trend going on. For example, that political interest rises during election time. And to rule this out, I include another control group. That is the control group for the period. In the end, you compare this control group to the treatment group, and then there should be a difference between experimental groups. So in sum, I have 4 waves in the school year of 2017 and 2018. I have 30 classes in 3 schools, almost 600 students, and they are 15 or 16 years old. And I look at the program of ProDemos in the Netherlands, which is quite representative for on-site citizenship education in terms of scope and activity. Now on to the results. In this table, you see the results of the difference in difference estimators. And you basically see that the programs do not have an effect on political interest, internal or external political efficacy, voting intention, or support for democracy. But it does have an effect on political knowledge. I made a graph where you can see the difference in control group between, or the difference in political knowledge between the control group and the treatment group. And here the treatment takes place between time 1 and time 2. And you can see a clear peak in the treatment group that remains high over time. And what is not shown here is that this peak is not caused by the pre-test sensitization or period effects. You also see that the control group does sort of catch up in the end, and this will probably be due to the formal curriculum in the school. In the second hypothesis, I tested whether these programs have a differential effect on different types of social groups. And in this table, you can see, again, a large number of non-effects. And this means that the pre-existing inequalities are reproduced by the on-site citizenship education. There are, however, some significant interactions or three-way interactions for gender and educational level. And I will highlight them over here. So what you see here is that there are no differences in the control group at both time 1 and time 2. So that is before and after the treatment. And there's also in the treatment group no difference at time 1. But in time 2, girls have some more support for democracy, which implies that there is a small creation of an inequality that wasn't there before. In this graph, you see again for their external political efficacy. So this is the feeling that the political system is responsive to your needs, the needs of your group. You see again that in the control group, there are no differences before and after the treatment. And you see in the treatment group that girls have a marginally lower external political efficacy than boys, which again points to some slight creation of an inequality. These are the differences regarding educational level. For the control group, again, you see that there are no differences between lower educated youngsters or higher educated ones before and after their treatment. And in the treatment group, you see that the political knowledge was already higher for higher educational students, but their growth rate is also steeper, which points to an accelerating effect. With regard to internal political efficacy, we see a compensation effect. So again, in the control group, we see no differences at time 1 and time 2. And in the treatment group, we see that students in lower educational levels have a higher growth rate than those in the higher educated levels. So to conclude, the first thing stands out is the large number of non-effects. On-site citizenship education programs do have a robust and lasting effect on political knowledge, but not on values or behavior. And apparently, like the short-term nature of these programs is not enough to affect political values and behavior. And this is quite in line with the literature that states that it takes a lot to affect value or attitude and behavior. And political knowledge is like the first thing that you can influence. The second thing that stands out is that the programs generally do not have a differential effect on different social groups. Many pre-existing differences are reproduced, as you can see in the table below. And when I do find differential effects, I see evidence for both compensation and acceleration. So on-site citizenship education compensates the gap in internal efficacy between higher and lower education. But this increase in efficacy is not paralleled by a similar increase in their political knowledge. Instead, this gap even accelerates. And tentatively, I even identified that the programs may create differences that were not there before. For example, what I told you about the external political efficacy of girls that decreased, where it remained the same for boys. And altogether, this study shows that inequalities in democratic engagement are of a structural nature and that they are not easily remedied by citizenship education. So I think that the high expectations for these citizenship programs need to be tempered, as in most cases, they are not able to close the gaps in democratic engagement. That does not mean that I think that these programs should be abandoned at all, because I do think that they have a very valuable addition to the current citizenship education. And I participated in a lot of I visited a lot of classes when they went to this program, and you can really see a sort of change in how they think about politics during the day. So I think it is a very valuable way of citizenship education. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. The floor is for Henk to reflect on the presentation and the significance for political socialization.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Laura. I have three reactions, let's say. First of all, what I like is the concern about the democratic citizenship education. You know, we have seen it the last couple of weeks. It's clear democratic leaders are not born, they are made or not, and the same applies to citizens. There is no democracy gene in us. It's only we cannot. If there is no education, there is no democracy in our psyche. So democratic citizenship education is an important topic, and we all know that it's extremely difficult to teach that subject matter in school. And school, the lessons maatschappijleer of maatschappijwetenschap cannot be, that probably is not sufficient for this democratic citizenship education. So additional initiatives are welcome. That's coming to the second point. That is ProDemos. It's great that Laura is studying the effects of this program, of this new institution. I like ProDemos very much. Actually, I'm one of the founders, together with Wim Ditman. I have seen thousands of young people coming to The Hague and meeting politicians, and you see the difference in their attitude. They are surprised. At least, probably they will never forget this one day in The Hague, talking with politicians, sitting in the second chamber, walking on the square there, seeing the journalists, the dynamics of politics. You know, I compare it with the teacher biology. You can learn biology, the plants and the birds and the names, etc., from a book, but most instructive is and most effective is the teacher biology who takes the children, the youth, to a park or in the woods and showing the things in reality. And ProDemos makes it possible. Experiential learning about politics where politics is. That was our goal, starting with ProDemos, and we have seen it growing and being effective. What is also so positive about ProDemos, because it's courageous and asks Laura and other people to study the effects. They're not simply saying we are so good, and no, they want to have a study of the effects. Why? Because you cannot expect that the program is very effective from the beginning. You have to test and to improve the program. The didactics, it's extremely complicated, difficult to do, and research has an important contribution to that. So that is so very positive is doing research about democratic citizenship education. It's relevant, scientifically interesting. Second point is it's fascinating to study the new ProDemos on-site program on politics. And the third point is what I like very much in Laura's work is her methodology. It's kind of quasi-experimental, it's panel studies, and especially Solomon 4 group design. I'm very much in favor of that design. It's hardly applied in political socialization research, but it is, in my view, the best thing to do. But it costs so much time and so much money. Maybe that's the explanation that it's not applied so often. But Laura has done it using so many students to create all these 4 groups. But that makes the outcome very, very convincing, because all the other factors more or less are excluded. In other research designs, you have always in your back of your head, okay, maybe there's another reason or another initiative. But in this research design, the research is very convincing. So, very positive about the idea behind the research, concern about democratic citizenship, a very interesting subject for research, and an excellent methodology.
Yeah, thank you, Henk. If you would then, same question to you and Laura as I asked Bert and Maarten, if you were to come up with statements about the nature of political psychology in the light of the things you've been describing from the first photo until the findings by Laura.
Let me start. I know that Laura has a long list. But I have two points. I completely agree with Bert Kleinerman when so the comparison of the quality of research is much better. You know, in the former years, 30 years ago, we were happy with correlation studies. You know, if the father and the mother and the son or daughter think about the same way, it was concluded here we have a clear evidence of influence, you know, simple correlations. It's incredible that we have now this quasi-experimental studies with Solomon for group design, thanks to the technological advancement, of course. I mean, you cannot compare. So very positive, the quote. What struck me now, and I made the same mistake probably, is that political socialization research is almost non-political, because it focused on the family, the father and mother, the sister and brother. It focused on history and maatschappij, the textbooks and teachers. A lot of analysis of newspapers. You cannot imagine nowadays that it was considered an important socialization agent, but it was. Analyzing television, you know, but we almost never analyze the influence of politicians directly on young people. That makes it more or less non-political or apolitical political socialization research. And of course, in the past, the influence of the leaders went through the family, through the school, through the mass media. But nowadays, you know, remember Trump twittering directly to the citizens without any interruption by journalists, no directly, and people like it. So they are open for it, for the direct influence of political leaders and political parties, and etc. So that is something that I forgot it, the political leaders, but maybe that we should do more in the future. I have to say that Crystal has had always an interest in what politicians say, rhetorics, the talks. I like it very much, but it was considered more or less as another domain. But political communication is crucial also for political socialization.
Thanks. Laura.
Yeah, so I think that the field of political socialization progressed enormously. There's been an expansion of the number of socializing agents, where I think in the beginning, the main focus was on the family or maybe the school. There are nowadays much more socializing agents, as Henk already told in his opening speech. I think also the research into schools has expanded tremendously over the years, and it might even have developed in a whole new subfield of citizenship education. And I think that nowadays there's more focus on political socialization as an interactive and a dynamic process, so that it's not a one-way process of the parent to their children, but also that their children may influence their parents, for example. There are a lot of new data sets in progress that use surveys among adults as well as their children. For example, a colleague of mine, Lynette, is doing this. And also, for example, what I do in my study, that you see, that you test whether there are differential effects of, for example, citizenship education. So not that, citizenship education or socializing agents have one general effect on all subjects, so to say, but that they might affect these subgroups differently. I think that is a very valuable contribution that you see happening more nowadays. But for example, also interaction with context. So not only the individual context. So for example, the class characteristics or the school characteristics that might have an influence on students, but also the context of the political system, or even time in which time period you grow up. And what I also think that adds to these dynamic or interactive process of political socialization is the interaction or combination of different socializing agents. For example, we have this study by Neundorf and colleagues in 2016 that see whether schools can compensate for missing parental socialization. So that were my ideas about the field.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Let us now turn to Crystal for the final topic of profiling before turning to the general discussion.
Thank you, Mark. I have to say that I'm most pleased to be here with you. It's always exciting, a meeting of political psychology, and especially a meeting in the Netherlands about political psychology. And I would like to share with you the history of political psychology in the Netherlands from my personal point of view. And I will pay attention not only to profiling and the importance of personality in politics, but also to the study of political language and to political impression management and the importance of perception, because as I think those three phenomena are really connected to each other. One can not really separate them, and they are also connected to political socialization. And I completely agree with Henk Dekker, what he said about the importance of leadership socialization, because there you have the importance of personality, of personal history, of rhetoric. It's all there. So it's very important for future research, as I think. Let me share a picture with you now. I hope you can see it. You can, what do we see here? It is a picture taken in San Francisco in July 1987 at the temporary apartment in San Francisco of Martin Brouwer and his wife, Joanneke Klaassen. The photo shows Martin Brouwer to the right, his wife next to him, and then that's me. The photo was taken at a party organized by Martin and Joanneke, a Dutch party, and they were so kind to invite me, even though I was Flemish, but it was really a very nice party. And the party was organized at the event of the annual meeting of the International Society of Political Psychology in 1987. Unfortunately, since some time, Martin and Joanneke are no longer among us. Martin Brouwer was the head of the Baschwitz Institute at the University of Amsterdam, and he held a chair in public opinion formation and collective behavior, and he taught a course in political psychology there. I was fascinated by this discipline right from the start. And at the time of the party in San Francisco, I had finished my PhD in communication science at University of Ghent in Belgium. And the subject of my PhD was political language. I developed a method in political semantics that focused on metaphor analysis. metaphor is, as I see it, very appropriate to measure emotion in political language, and using my method, which is entitled Metaphor Power Index method, one may be able to collect political meaning, to clarify and to forecast even political, social, and economic developments. Martin Brouwer had founded in 1985 the Dutch Society of Political Psychology. A first conference took place at the University of Nijmegen. It was organized with the help of Jaap van Ginneken and Jos Meloen and others. By the way, this picture was taken by Jos Meloen. I had attended the conference there and presented a paper there in Nijmegen, which was published in 1986 in a volume edited by Martin Brouwer. It was entitled, this volume, Political Psychology in the Netherlands. And it was, my paper there was on language and ideology, a representation of the function of ideology in the political use of language. In 1986, Martin Brouwer was a conference chair at the annual conference of ISPP in Amsterdam, a function which Bert Kleinerman and myself would take up in 1999. Right from the start, so I was fascinated indeed by political psychology. And after my PhD research in Ghent, at the University of Ghent, I had a research position there in the field of political socialization. I was looking for what teachers meant for their pupils and students as political reference figures. But in 1988, I received a position as a lecturer at the Department of Communication at the University of Amsterdam, later ASCOR, and I became right away active at the board of both the Dutch Society of Political Psychology and VPP, and also ISPP. And there I got to know many Dutch colleagues, many Dutch scholars that include indeed Henk Dekker, with whom I had the pleasure and the honor to collaborate over the years many times, not only in panels, but also in book projects and in journals such as the journal Henk already mentioned, Politics, Culture and Socialization, which in fact is kind of a European journal in political socialization and political psychology. So also I met Bert Kleinerman in effect in 1991. I organized a panel at the ISPP meeting in Helsinki, in which Bert participated, and also colleague Georgi Bochechov from Ukraine, that was still part of Russia at the time. And the panel was entitled Political Symbolism, Language and Communication. I also remember we had a very nice dinner then at a Russian restaurant. And socializing was always very important in political psychology, in the Netherlands, but also at the international level. I kept my original focus on political semantics and political language until now, and also metaphors are important for me, political metaphors. But through the ISPP conferences, I learned to broaden my research interests. And already at the ISPP meeting in San Francisco, I was really fascinated by the work of Sean Rosenberg from UCLA about the effect of perception and appearance in politics. I was encouraged by my students in Amsterdam to undertake research on what I called political impression management. So I did this type of research first in the Netherlands and then later in Flanders as I moved in 2001 from Ascot to University of Antwerp. I published articles and even a book on the topic of political impression management in Flanders and in the Netherlands in 2004. And the idea behind political impression management, that especially in the age of modernization of the media landscape, we are influenced by cues in the process of information processing. Cues such as the appearance of politicians, such as their rhetoric, such as their personality, but our perception and our impressions of their personality are often mediated by their presentation and by their appearance. It is for sure that there is hardly or not at all found a relation between the appearance of someone and the qualities, the personal qualities, but at the same time, we make all the time this connection, all of us. So from that point of departure, we started in impression management studies that people, if the audience, if voters take those conclusions based on presentation, then it is possible, of course, to manipulate the impression and the perception by using a favorable political presentation, presentation that is considered as favorable in politics. And this was one new focus of research that also became popular in political psychology internationally, but also in the Netherlands. And then there was this other focus. Now I will talk about profiling and the importance of personality in politics. There was the ISPP conference in Santiago de Compostela in 1994. And I had met there Aubrey Immelman, with whom I collaborate until now. Aubrey Immelman developed this method for psychological profiling of political leaders. And I applied it with my students for a range of politicians, such as Angela Merkel, such as Vladimir Putin. Also, I published a book, The Clash of the Titans in Dutch, with profiles of Belgian politicians in an effort to explain their lack of ability to form a government. And I explained it through their personality. So here we are in the field of profiling, psychological profiling. And of course, this was of interest also already from antiquity to political leaders, because they always thought it was important to know something about the personality of the enemy, of course, or the competitor. But it is only in 1942 that there came a real scientific approach for profiling political leaders. Within a unit that was the predecessor of the CIA in USA. There was a group of scientists led by a Harvard professor who made an assessment at a distance of the personality of Adolf Hitler, the enemy number one at that time. It was an interdisciplinary group, and there came an extensive report of more than 1,200 pages made by assessment at a distance of Adolf Hitler in 1943, which was able to forecast that Adolf Hitler would suicide himself, and also that made a diagnosis that he was paranoid. And historians until now agree on the fact that he was paranoid. Now, this was the start of the real scientific approach for profiling political leaders. After the Second World War, there was started up a unit within the CIA by a young psychiatrist, Gerald Post. And Gerald Post, he is still active within ISPP. He attends every annual meeting of ISPP, and he is very easy to talk with. He is a very charming man, and he started this unit for advising US presidents and US advisors, so that they were able to anticipate upon the behavior of the leaders that the president and his advisors, the foreign world leaders that he had to cope with and to communicate with. So they prepared reports for the president and for these advisors. This center led by Jerry Post. Then there came also other forms of assessment at a distance. Jerry Post mainly worked with psychohistory as a method. He paid a lot of attention to the life history of political leaders, and others followed his path, and they wrote books about psychohistory within political psychology. The study of political leadership and also psychohistory became very important. But there were other approaches within this field of personality and politics within political psychology. Most of these approaches were in fact based on various types of content analysis. There was operational coding, for instance, but there was also the approach by David Winter, motive imagery. It also works with a form of content analysis. And David Winter looks at motives of political leaders. And then there is also the approach by Peter Soetfeld, who looks at complexity, and this is also a cognitive variable that is really very much connected to the study of political rhetoric, you know, because this variable, integrative complexity, developed by Peter Soetfeld, can be used in combination, for instance, with variables to study political metaphor, in political speech and political rhetoric, with such a variable as the use of hyperbole in political rhetoric, in political language. So there is really a connection between these cognitive variables used in the study of political personality and the study of variables in political rhetoric. So there is an important connection.
Kissel, sorry for interrupting, with an eye on the time.
Yes, okay, sorry. Then there is the method by Aubrey Immelman, which I'm using myself for profiling political leaders. That is also a form of content analysis, of course. And it is a combination of communication science and of clinical psychology. So it is really a method for political psychology. It is an important method in political psychology to profile political leaders. And what is so nice about the method is that it is exemplified in great detail by Aubrey Immelman, so that it becomes very objective and that it is easy to practice it by students. So that is one big asset of this method. So I can talk endlessly about profiling, but
if Crystal, if you would end up with some statements about how you think political psychology has changed from the moment that you were taken on this photo.
I have to say that first of all, I see links with my own work in the work of many younger scholars, and I'm very happy about it in the field of, for instance, personality and politics. I see the work of Alessandro Nai of Ascot, which is excellent, as I think. He uses Big Five instead of Immelman, but it's very good research, excellent. Then there is, in the field of political impression management, work by Sabine van Zuidam, who unfortunately cannot be here, and Eva Wisse. It is on public credibility, it's on perception in relation to personality, very exciting work. PhDs from Tilburg University under supervision of Professor Frank Hendricks, professor in public administration there. Really good work in political psychology. And then there is, for what concerns political rhetoric, the work at the Free University of Amsterdam by Amber Boernaams and Christian Burgers of Communication Science. Excellent work on political metaphor. For what concerns the statements, well, as I said, I agree with what Henk said about socialization of leaders, leadership socialization. Also, I agree with what Bert said about the quality of the research. I think the quality is excellent of the research in political psychology in the Netherlands. It is indeed much better than before. Political psychology research in the Netherlands nevertheless follows current trends in academia, and I think it's also my task to be a bit critical also about these trends. And what I see that is, there is, the research is important, it is excellent, it's very good. But it has really big focus in general on quantitative research and on big data research. And I fear that sometimes the context, this broad context with all those domains, one has to keep it in mind all the time. That is one thing. Another thing which is also affected, of course, by current trends in academia, is the fact that everything has to be perfect nowadays, and one has to be perfect, but maybe there should be some room for exploration and for making a bit risky explorations and risky research that is not that perfect, and sometimes I'm still missing it, even though I think the research I heard today is really excellent. Also, I must say, Mark, that personally I appreciate your research very much, because you pay attention to context, you pay attention to historical data. I like that very much. I have to tell it.
Well, thank you so much, Crystal. Thank you.
Yes. And I think these are the most important things I had to see.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Crystal. And actually, on that note, I have 10 statements collected now that I think should be quite revealing about the nature of political psychology as it currently is. I will mention them, but not before mentioning somebody else something else. And I have to say, Crystal, you brought it up, and I hope you're not. So I was really shocked when I heard it. But Jerry Post passed away in November.
Oh, I did.
And so I was a little surprised there was no reference on it on the ISPP website. But
I did. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He died of COVID.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So on that sad note, I have come up with 10 statements, and actually I would also be very interested to hear about the audience response and their. So I'm not really sure how to do it, but maybe I just read the 10 statements that I have. And then look for other reactions from the chat, and let's see if we can then come up with some response from our panel. So overall, my thought was that there's a general consensus that the quality of research has greatly improved, and this is to a large extent due to the comparative approach that political psychology is increasingly adopting, and that is a good thing. Bert also mentioned that political psychology is increasingly becoming experimental. I noticed from Laura's remarks and also from Crystal's remark that to a certain extent this is to be applauded, but at the same time it comes with sort of a simplification of the nature of the type of phenomena that we're studying. And so I was also triggered by Bert's initial observation that he actually liked political psychology better than social psychology, because, and that's, I wrote down in my own words, an observation from your presentation, Bert, that political psychology is essentially was an alternative to an increasingly methodologically and conceptually narrowing social psychology. And so I got the sense that as social psychology becomes a greater influence in political psychology nowadays, we're also moving towards this narrowing trend that social psychology has already been undergoing. And so I thought Maarten was very apt to recognize that we should really ask whether we need theoretical innovation. And so his focus on, I'm using older theories essentially, and now I'm studying them, and that sort of begs the question, so is there actually a need to go beyond social identity theory or the classic theories? Is there something to be gained from really focusing on, okay, how can we come up with new theories? So, and then from Henk, I wrote down political citizenship education is a key task for political psychologists, but also extremely difficult to do. And that also, of course, follows the findings from Laura. But it also means that as political psychologists, we actually have a duty to do so. And that means not just educating children, but it also means educating a broader audience about the type of insights that political psychology has. So, and I really loved Henk's statement, we should learn about politics where politics is. And so I think we should continually ask as political psychologists, are we really doing so? So as we're moving towards the lab, also because it's like increasingly easy to do lab research relative to doing risky, expensive field research, we may lose out on significant context and significant contextual factors. And that's also something I thought Laura was bringing up. Another thing that I noticed, and it's now my 6th point on the statement. So unmediated political communication is an increasingly important area of study. And so with politicians directly communicating to single individuals through social media, this is something that is very important, and it also means, and that I wrote it down as a separate statement, that political psychology should really start to focus also on political socialization of leaders. So from Laura, I also got this observation, which, by the way, I very much agree with, is that political socialization as a one example of a broader set of phenomena that political psychology studies is of considerable complexity, and this means we need to take into account many different contextual factors and dynamics. And so we may actually ask if, by focusing on this experimental approach, which goes a step beyond the comparative approach, but if we focus on the on the experimental approach, whether we're not losing this complexity of political processes and the critical importance of context. So I also loved the statements who I don't really, who I'm not able to trace it anymore to a particular speaker, but said the media landscape is changing. The media landscape is changing the nature of political psychological analysis, and that is, I don't know who said it. It may be Crystal who mentioned it, and it is with the introduction of social media, with the introduction of all new types of communication, we may actually dealing with a new type of phenomenon, type of political phenomena. And I would think it would be good to recognize how these new media actually influence political attitudes and so on. And so that is, I think, a very interesting area of research. And there are a lot of people that I know that are already doing it, but giving it explicit recognition that this is the underlying trend. Okay, we have all these new media that have a different impact on our political attitudes and our political viewpoints. I think this is a very important topic. I already mentioned that the political psychology should focus on the political socialization of the leader, and I loved as an end statement by Crystal this notion that nowadays everything needs to be perfect, and there should be more room for risk, and I fully appreciate that, and I strongly support that. Bert mentioned that in the early days, research was to a certain extent so of far lesser quality, and I think this may be true. But on the other hand, I also have the impression that at that time there was less publication pressure, less of a concern with, let's say, difficult publications, and with it also sort of the room to think and reflect rather than do. And so with this, there may have been greater openness for the great ideas rather than the great research. So on that note, let me also invite the floor for some responses. If you have, then I would be very interested to hear.
I see that there's no comments in the chat or Q&A box. So if one of you has a comment or a question, you can type it in one of those boxes and we can read it out loud for discussion.
Everybody already left?
No, there's still some participants in case, yeah. So, oh, there's a question. Martin Roseman. So Mark, if you you see the Q&A button,
Yeah, so
if you open it, you can see it.
So I only see, so I opened the Q&A. I have the chat box open. Hi, many thanks for your interest. I have one question to Bert and Henk. I'm curious if there are particular people who inspired you to become active in political psychology and use this label, like Martin Brouwer was influential for Crystal. Likewise, for me, for example, Henk Dekker was an important source of inspiration. Now, there you go. And so Martin Rosema is the asker. I still remember that when I studied political psychology in Leiden in 1990s, he gave very inspiring lectures on political psychology and political socialization. He was also the one who gave me a PhD candidate in Leiden a leaflet about ISPP, which made me join them. And ISPP has, next to ECPR, since then become an important part of my academic home. Did you also have people who inspired you to get connected to the label of political psychology in your early career? Henk and Bert. Maybe Henk, oh, sorry. Yeah.
What I remember is that I was very much impressed by Luc Hagedorn. Luc Hagedorn, who was, I think, professor at Catholic University in Nijmegen, who did an extensive study among right-wing thoughts, activities of young people. And that made there was a large-scale study, a lot of media attention, and I was really impressed by the quality of the research and also how important, and it showed me how important scientific research can be, because people were really shocked by the outcome and recognized the importance of finding out what young people think. So that is what I remember very much. Then, of course, from the past, I remember Crystal with her excellent work, always surprising new approaches, hard science. I mean, yeah, that was, and my friends like Rüdiger Meyerberg in Germany, then German in the United States, Russell Farnan, who organized excellent conferences in the world on several places. I remember the meetings in Sankelmark with colleagues from Central and Eastern Europe. Incredible, coming in 5 men in one car, bringing their own food because they had no money, and talking about democracy. Can you imagine what it means? And what to do in a communist system. Now, yeah, how it works in the communist system. Fascinating time. So I have many inspirators, and I'm very grateful to them.
Bert, the mute is on. Bert, you're mute.
It's okay now? Yeah, okay. So I was very much interested and also involved in all kinds of activities of labor unions in that time. And my dissertation is about a campaign, mobilization campaign of the Dutch labor union on shortening of the work week. But what I did, and I think that's the smartest thing I ever did, when I finished my dissertation, I visited all the people in the United States that I cited. So I met with Terro, I met with Tilly, I met with McCarthy. So I met everybody in the United States. I was there for 6 months traveling. at some point people began to start asking me, do you know how so and so is doing? Because I was doing all this traveling. So that has been a crucial half year, which put me in touch, and actually with all these people I still have, I'm still working with, and so it's, as I said, it's the smartest thing I ever did.
Yeah.
Now I have time to think. I could mention so many other people. I can, you know, for instance, Bert Kleinerman. I forgot to tell something about Bert Kleinerman. His very important work at Free University, and in the United States, we had a conference with, for instance, Dick Nini. Incredible, his work, his publication, so inspiring, and one of the most interesting meetings was with Mike Dukakis. Maybe you may remember that once he wanted to become president of the United States, and I had the opportunity to observe his campaign. And I was struck by the fact that how important impression management is. I followed him, I could participate in all kinds of activities, and one day there was a photo up with a tank, a military tank, and he was expected to sit in the tank and to make the impression of strong leadership. But unfortunately, Mike Dukakis was a very small man, and he was almost lost in the big tank. So instead of a strong impression, that was not too good. Later, he became professor in political science in Florida, and I have met him several times, and I was really impressed. Once I asked him, you know, why have you not copied the dirty tricks from the Republicans? With, you know, they were showing movies about a dirty harbor in Boston, but the movies were made somewhere else, you know. But then he answered, if I can become president of the United States only by using these kind of dirty tricks, I do not want to become a president.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other responses from the or follow-ups from the audience? Oh, there's one more, I think.
I would.
Oh, no, yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, yes or no? No.
No.
Yeah. The thing that I wanted to mention that was, so the political psychology, the big advantage of political psychology over social psychology is that it has a clear domain to focus on. So you want to know more about politics, not about general interactions between people. And then very important for that is comparison. I mentioned that also already, but also, and that has not been mentioned so much, is mixed methods. Really mixed methods. Experiments is wonderful, it's fine. If you also do some focus groups, if you also do a survey, a mixed method, it's outrageously expensive. That's the problem, but it is worth the effort.
Yeah, I agree very much.
And there's one more question I saw, or two more even.
Two more. Okay, thanks. Janneke, we learned a lot about the research. I'm also curious how the teaching of these topics changed over time, in your view.
You know, I'm retired already for 10 years, so I don't teach anymore.
One of the striking things I would say is that there are few classes actually on a specific topic of political psychology, so that has the topic political psychology. I don't know if it ever has been different, but so for instance,
as far as I know, there is I don't know about classes in political psychology. I know there's some schools in the United States that have classes in political psychology, but
actually, I'm teaching a course in political psychology at University of Antwerp in the Master in Political Communication, which I set up myself. I teach also a seminar in political communication and a course in methods in political psychology, and also a course in political rhetoric. In October 1, I will be emeritus. And I'm happy to tell you that my courses will be continued in Antwerp in political psychology, and I will continue myself the course in methods in political psychology.
Yeah. So the striking thing is I've been giving this introductory presentation on political psychology for students of psychology students who are considering a master degree. And so this is for the Netherlands Institute for Psychologists. And so there are a lot of people who have an interest in political psychology, and inevitably the question at the end is, so where can I study political psychology? And then I have to say, well, you know, it's somewhere in Amsterdam, it's somewhere in Groningen, it's somewhere in Nijmegen, but it doesn't have its own umbrella position. Frank Gooitjes, when you look at the current research in political psychology, are there any topics that make you go like, here we go again?
Well, yeah. I don't have an immediate association with it, but
yeah.
First, the question about where can you study political psychology in the Netherlands? I'm emeritus professor as well, but in Leiden has continued the study in political psychology, both in the master and in the bachelor and master program. So if people have an interest in political psychology, maybe Leiden is an option.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But take into account that so that it falls in the political science program.
Yes, yes.
And so none of the students come from psychology. That struck me when I maybe things have changed since Femke has taken over, but it's remarkable.
Yeah, you know, in former times we had a Dutch Association for Political Psychology. Bert and Crystal have referred to that association. One of the things that could be helpful is that there could be an organization that could promote a professorship in political psychology in the Netherlands. As far as I know, there is no professor at this time with this title. It would be helpful to think about that. And about the second question, or the last question, you know, his name was mentioned several times, Jos Meloen, who did a lot of studies about authoritarianism. You can say, okay, we know a lot about this theory about authoritarian personality, but still, I would say, if you read this wonderful book, I don't know at all, it is important to continue research in this field with the new methods and data analysis techniques that we have nowadays. So maybe the topic may be old-fashioned, but the question behind it is still very relevant, I would say.
I agree, yeah, certainly. Yeah.
So far, psychology, social psychology, political psychology has never been very good in taking context into account.
Yeah.
That you need comparison for that, but even if you do comparison, you still need theories about why are these differences that we find.
Yeah. So on that note, because it's 5:02, we have reached the end of our session. Thank you so much for all the contributors and for staying on board. And I refer back to Mike.
Yes, thank you, Mark. It was a very inspiring session, a lot of nice and good insights, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. Yeah, we can leave the channel open if people want to talk more, but we can also just leave this meeting. And thank you all for all your presentations and insights.